Listen closely. This is not a story of politics, but of war. I witnessed it with my own eyes. A young African commander who refused to bow, and an empire that could not endure the insult. Traore's defiance was not mere words, it was fire. Netanyahu heard that fire and struck back harder than anyone imagined. What followed was no debate, no diplomacy, but a clash that shook continents. War begins in silence. It starts in that sharp stillness when one man decides compromise is finished and surrender is death. That moment came when Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain who seized Burkina Faso's destiny, stood against the weight of empire and said, "No." He did not whisper it. He carved it into the air, and that refusal, sharper than any blade, lit the fire. I was there when it happened. Not in hidden chambers, but in the eyes of his people. Crowds gathered in Ouagadougou, faces marked by decades of poverty and betrayal. They had watched leaders crumble under foreign pressure, watched Africa's wealth signed away in smoke-filled rooms. But this time was different. This time the leader did not bend. Traore's words were simple. Burkina Faso will not surrender. No theatrics, no long speech, just steel. And in that steel, a continent stirred awake. I felt it in the air. The ghost of Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah standing unseen but unbroken behind him. His defiance was more than politics. It was the resurrection of Africa's buried courage. But defiance is never free. When a small nation says no to a greater power, it is not a gesture. It is war. Netanyahu knew it. His fury crossed oceans. To him, Traore's defiance was rebellion against the natural order. A younger man spitting in the face of an empire that demanded obedience. That day the city itself transformed. Murals spread across the walls overnight. Traore was painted in the colors of Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah. Young men wore his image like armor. His name echoed in markets, barracks, and streets. The old, the forgotten, the betrayed. They whispered, "At last, someone stands." But I knew, as every soldier knows, that silence before battle carries the weight of storms. Netanyahu's quiet was more dangerous than his words. Israel did not rush to speak. They waited, calculated. I could almost hear the gears grinding, sanctions drafted, intelligence sharpened, knives polished in secret. In that silence, I studied Netanyahu. He was not just a politician. He was a tactician, a man who believed in preemptive strikes and overwhelming force. For him, Traore's refusal was a wound to his pride. And a wounded pride in the heart of a man like Netanyahu is as dangerous as any missile. Yet in those first days, Traore walked among his people with calm defiance. He showed no fear, at least not in public. He addressed soldiers directly, reminding them that loyalty was no longer to foreign masters, but to the soil beneath their boots. He spoke of sovereignty, of blood spilled for freedom, of the price of bending to those who saw Africa as a mine to be emptied. His words were blunt, not polished. Iron forged for men who carried rifles, not pens. I watched him climb atop a battered truck, his voice rising above the dust and the cheers. We have no choice but to stand. To surrender is to accept chains, and I will not lead you into slavery. They will strike us. They will strangle us. But they will not break us. The soldiers roared back, fists raised. And in that roar I heard both courage and doom. Because every act of defiance paints a target on the one who speaks it. In that moment, Netanyahu marked Traore. The intelligence network stirred. Allies of Israel whispered in corridors of power, doubting how long he could last. Western media began their quiet poisoning, headlines painting him as reckless, dangerous, destabilizing. Each article was another bullet, aimed not at his body but at his image. Yet the more they attacked, the more his people clung to him. His defiance became theirs. His courage became their shield. What began as one man's refusal became an anthem across the land. Wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by symbols, by myths, by the stories men tell themselves before marching into fire. Traore had become a myth overnight, and Netanyahu, in his fury, would stop at nothing to crush it. The stage was set. A young African leader had challenged the order of things. An Israeli titan, long feared and unchallenged, prepared his retaliation. And I, standing between them, watching the pieces move, knew the first strike was coming. And it would be brutal. The first strike never begins with bombs. It begins with silence, the kind that suffocates nations. And I watched it fall over Burkina Faso like a shadow. Netanyahu had heard Traore's defiance, and he answered not with words, but with force hidden in economics, politics, and shadows. That was his opening blow. The retaliation began quietly. Israeli-linked businesses vanished from Burkina Faso overnight. Contracts were torn apart. Credit lines disappeared. Aid was frozen. Pressure poured in from Western partners. It was not yet a war of armies, but a war of strangulation, the kind that bleeds a nation without firing a single bullet. I could see the strategy. He moved to break Traore by starving his government, turning the very machinery of survival into a weapon. He meant to prove that defiance was a luxury his people could not afford. But Traore did not flinch. Standing before his people, uniform dusty and voice steel, he said, "They will try to choke us. Let them try. We were born in hunger, but we will not die in chains." The crowd answered with a roar. Every push only hardened them. Pressure did not fracture Traore, it forged him. Netanyahu saw it, and so the second strike came. Whispers at first, strange movements along the borders, unmarked planes circling, unfamiliar faces slipping into the capital. Traore's aides reported intercepted messages, plots brewing in the shadows. This was covert power. Intelligence trained to destabilize, infiltrate, and strike without leaving fingerprints. I watched sabotage, rumors, betrayal unfold. Senior officers were courted with foreign promises: switch sides and be rewarded, stay loyal and be crushed. Traore moved fast. He reshuffled his command, rooted out traitors, tightened the inner circle. In the barracks, he looked his soldiers in the eye and said, "If I fall, you fall. If I live, you live. Our fate is the same." It was not rhetoric, it was survival. Sanctions tightened. Doors closed. Western media fed a steady drip. Headlines that painted him reckless, dictatorial, dragging his people into ruin. Propaganda became a weapon that corrodes faith, turning supporters into doubters and doubters into traitors. Traore fought back with the airwaves' raw, defiant speeches that framed him as the last line of defense for Africa's dignity. "Let the world see we are punished because we refuse to kneel. If we must suffer, we will suffer standing, not crawling." His people believed him. They painted his face on walls and marched to his words. As the narrative war raged, Netanyahu escalated again. Foreign advisors, mercenaries, supplies seeping into neighboring states. Borders tightened into fault lines. Every crossing smelled of danger. Still, Traore did not bend. He forged new alliances. Russia, sympathetic African governments, movements worn out by Western control. Maps shifted, loyalties redrew. Africa stands with us. I realized then that Netanyahu had forged something he never intended, a symbol far larger than Traore himself. Symbols are dangerous, especially when a wounded pride is at stake. A man like Netanyahu, humiliated, will not accept silence. So the next strike widened, not only economic covert or propaganda, it became open escalation. Israeli influence pulled Western partners into the squeeze. Aid convoys stopped, supplies were blocked. Trade lines were severed. Burkina Faso was walled in, turned into a besieged fortress. And in that siege, Traore surprised them. He grew bolder. "This proves we frighten them," he told the people. "If we were weak, they'd ignore us. They strike because we are strong." He turned pain into pride, hunger into fuel. People tightened their belts and shouted his name louder. Netanyahu had underestimated him. But underestimation begets escalation. Neither side could back down. Traore too defiant, Netanyahu too invested. Collision was inevitable. You could feel it in the air, the crackle before lightning, the silence before an explosion. The first strike, silence. The second, shadows. The third, propaganda. The fourth, siege. And now the fifth was coming, one to shatter silence and ignite the battlefield. The quiet war went loud. The covert went open. It started with border fires. Militants with advanced rifles, night vision, and drones moved across the northern scrub. Too organized, too well supplied to be local. Everyone knew where they came from, though few spoke it. Netanyahu had pulled the mask off. Villages burned. Refugees streamed south. Fear spread even among the brave. Whispers grew. They're coming for the capital. Traore would not wait. He summoned his generals, spread maps across the table, and slammed his fist down. We will not let them choose the battlefield. We will choose it. We strike first. Mobilization followed. Armored columns rolled north. Helicopters thundered. Young men who had never left their villages marched under his command. Burkina Faso's flag rose in the dust. No surrender, only advance. At dawn the first clash came. Netanyahu's proxies had fortified an outpost by the border, but Traore's forces moved with fierce precision. Mortars pounded the compound. Gunfire split the dry air. By mid-morning the outpost had fallen. Dozens of mercenaries lay dead, weapons caches seized, and among them the proof Traore needed. Israeli markings, foreign scripts, evidence of outside hands. That same day he stood before his soldiers, raising a captured rifle high. This is not the weapon of a farmer. This is not the weapon of our soil. This is the hand of the foreigner, the hand that fears our freedom. And today, you cut it off. The roar that answered shook the camp. His men were no longer just soldiers. They had become crusaders for survival. But Netanyahu did not relent. If proxies fell in the field, he would escalate again. Drones swarmed above Ouagadougou, their buzzing like vultures circling death. Explosions tore through supply lines. Bridges crumbled. Convoys burned in the night. This was not war in trenches. It was war in shadows and skies, and it was merciless. Traore met it with defiance. He ordered anti-air units in the capital, wove networks of lookouts across the countryside. Farmers became scouts. Children carried messages. Villages transformed into fortresses. The nation itself became a battlefield. Each strike only hardened Burkina Faso, leaner, sharper, more relentless. And then came the moment no one foresaw. A rally in the heart of Ouagadougou drew tens of thousands. Flags waved, voices rose, Defiance thundered. With fire in his eyes, Traore's voice carried beyond his people, across the world. Let Netanyahu hear me. Let his allies hear me. We are not afraid of his bombs, his money, his lies. We are a people who have tasted hunger, who have lived through storms, and we are still here. You cannot kill what refuses to die. The roar was deafening. That was the moment Netanyahu lost the narrative. Every bomb birthed 10,000 new loyal hearts. Every act of sabotage created 10,000 louder voices. The fight had grown beyond weapons. It was now a war of spirit. But spirit bleeds too. Battles raged for weeks. Towns changed hands. Roads burned. Names of the dead mounted nightly. Still, Traore did not bend. Exhausted but steady, he told his men, this war is not just against Netanyahu. It is against every empire that has fed on our soil. If we win here, we win not only for Burkina Faso. We win for Africa. His words swept the continent. Murals rose, songs spread, and his name joined the whispers of Nkrumah, Sankara, Lumumba. He was no longer just a captain. He had become a symbol, and that was Netanyahu's greatest miscalculation. By trying to crush him, he elevated him. By trying to isolate him, he united Africa behind him. The fire Netanyahu lit burned beyond his control. When the dust finally settled, when the guns gave way to uneasy quiet, one truth was clear. Traore had not been destroyed. He had survived. More than that, he had grown. Netanyahu had struck with silence, shadows, siege, and fire. Traore had answered with defiance, unity, and spirit. The clash had ended, but the war was not over. Neither man had fallen, but both had been changed. I looked at Traore not as a soldier or politician, but as a force of history. Scarred, hardened, tempered by fire. And Netanyahu, far away, had learned the same lesson all empires eventually face. The harder you press a people, the stronger they become. The battlefield was quiet, but the world knew the truth. The clash had exploded, and though the smoke faded, the echoes of that war, the war of wills between Netanyahu and Traore, would not fade for generations. In the silence after the storm, one truth remained. Africa had found its voice, and it was no longer whispering. It was roaring. Wars are not always won by bullets. Sometimes they are won by what endures when the fire dies down. And in that moment, I knew this struggle was no longer just about Israel, no longer just about Netanyahu. It was about the soul of Africa, and it was far from over. The final stage of the clash did not come in fire, but in silence. After weeks of battles, Netanyahu expected Traore to break beneath hunger, fatigue, and fear. But instead, Burkina Faso grew louder. Villages sang war songs, cities painted murals, soldiers marched with sharper discipline. And across the world a question spread: why does this young captain frighten an empire? The answer was simple: because he refused to kneel. Traore's forces pushed back mercenaries, dismantled bases, reclaimed roads. Proof of foreign sabotage was laid bare. Photos of seized weapons and captured operatives flooded social media. With each revelation, Netanyahu's image darkened. To allies he looked desperate, to enemies exposed, to his own people weak. The mask of invincibility cracked. Traore seized the moment, his voice carried across Africa's airwaves. We are no longer the hunted. We are the hunters. We are no longer the prey. We are the storm, and to those who think Africa will bow again, let them hear me. We are standing, and we are not alone. From Bamako to Kinshasa, from Dar to Dar es Salaam, the continent roared with him. But Netanyahu did not fade quietly. He ordered one final strike, a decapitation blow. Drones launched, satellites tracked, coordinates locked. The night sky above Ouagadougou erupted in flame. Explosions shattered buildings, dozens died, and for a moment it seemed the young leader had been silenced. But at dawn, through the rubble and smoke, Traore stood scarred but unbroken, microphone in hand. His voice thundered, "Is this all you have? Is this your empire? You can break our walls, but you will never break our spirit. Look at me. I am still here, and so is Africa." The defiance spread like wildfire. The war was no longer about bombs or guns. It was about dignity, about survival of spirit. Netanyahu discovered the truth every empire learns too late. You cannot bomb an idea. You cannot crush a people's hunger for freedom. You cannot silence a voice that has already awakened a continent. His strikes slowed, proxies scattered, the world's attention shifted. Yet the echo of the clash remained. Traore had not won every battle, but he had won something greater: the narrative, the spirit, the future. Netanyahu, despite all his power, had become the villain of the story. Empires do not fall in a single day. They fall piece by piece. When small nations rise, when the youth refuse to kneel, when one soldier, one captain, one voice says, "Enough." Netanyahu struck harder, unleashed his fury, but in doing so he forged his own shadow, a resistance louder than his threats, a defiance bigger than his bombs. And in that fire, Traore became more than a man. He became the echo of Africa's awakening. History does not remember who struck hardest. It remembers who stood tallest when the smoke cleared. And in this clash, when the world looked through the fire, it did not see Netanyahu, it saw Traore.